Long before anybody called this the United States or Canada, Indigenous nations moved freely across the land. Trade, ceremony, family, the idea of a border didn't exist, but when modern boundaries were drawn, those ancient roots were suddenly cut in two. Today, some Indigenous people still have the right to cross the border without a passport or green card. This video explains how those rights work, where they come from, and what they mean today. Before 1794, nations like the Anishinaabe, Blackfeet, Anishinaabe, Cree, and others traveled freely through what is now the northern United States and southern Canada. They traded, hunted, and visited relatives across what later became the 49th parallel. When European powers divided the continent, they never consulted Indigenous nations who already previously lived there. This division split communities, but Indigenous movements across that invisible line never completely stopped. In 1794, the Jay Treaty was signed between Great Britain and the United States to settle post-Revolution disputes. Article 3 of the treaty contained a crucial promise. Quote, it agreed that it shall be at all times to be free to the Indians dwelling on either side of the said boundary lines to pass and repass by land or inland navigation. This article recognized the existing rights of Indigenous people to travel, trade, and live across the new border without restrictions. At the time, this is not a new right being granted. It was recognitions of freedoms that have already existed. When the border was drawn, it cut directly through several Indigenous nations, including Mohawk, Akwesasne, Blackfeet, and Cree families found themselves on opposite sides overnight. The Jay Treaty's travel clause was one of the few legal mechanisms that acknowledged this injustice and sought to preserve Indigenous mobility. More than 2 centuries later, that clause continues to still influence border policy. The United States still honors the Jay Treaty through its immigration law. Section 289 of the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act recognizes the rights of, quote, American Indians born in Canada, unquote, to enter, live, and work in the U.S. without visas or green cards. To qualify, a person must show they have at least 50% Native American blood, a measure known as a blood quantum. Those who meet these requirements are legally considered to have the same rights to live and work in the U.S. as American Indians born there. Canada, however, does not formally recognize the Jay Treaty in its immigration laws. While Canada acknowledges the Indigenous rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, it has never enacted legislation mirroring the Jay Treaty clause. That means Indigenous people from the U.S. cannot automatically enter Canada under the same principle. This asymmetry causes ongoing debates and calls for policy changes, especially from First Nations whose lands straddle the border. The term blood quantum was introduced by the U.S. federal policy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to measure Indigenous ancestries as a fraction. For Jay Treaty purposes, 50% means a person has at least one parent or two grandparents who are fully blood Indigenous according to historical records or band documentation. Many Indigenous communities reject this concept because the identity is cultural and political, not mathematical. Still, for the U.S. enforcement, this rule remains in effect. These rights apply only to land crossings, not air travel. Indigenous people entering by land must provide acceptable documentation showing their ancestry. Common forms include a secure certificate of Indian status card issued by Canada, tribal membership cards, or certified genealogical documents. U.S. Customs and Border Protection reviews these papers and, if approved, allows entry without the need of a visa. Travelers can always work and reside in the U.S. indefinitely under these provisions. Communities like Akwesasne, located along the St. Lawrence River, are split between Quebec, Ontario, and New York State. Residents must cross the border daily for work, school, or family. The Jay Treaty provision ensures that these everyday movements remain legal, though documentation and inspection still apply. Other nations, such as Blackfeet on the Alberta-Montana border line, also rely on this recognition. In practice, not all officers are familiar with the Jay Treaty clause. Some travelers experience delays or are asked additional proof of ancestry. Advocacy groups continue to educate border staff and governments to ensure consistent application. Document standards can vary, which adds confusion, but the legal foundation remains valid under law. Indigenous mobility rights aren't unique to North America. In Scandinavia, the Sami people move across Norway, Sweden, and Finland for reindeer herding. The Trans-Tasman travel arrangement allows Maori citizens of New Zealand to live and work freely in Australia. These parallels show a growing recognition that Indigenous identity and movements often transcend modern borders. Cross-border rights supports family, unity, economic exchange, and cultural preservation. They enable participation in ceremonies, festivals, and trades that would otherwise require complex immigration processes. For many Indigenous nations, this freedom represents the endurance of sovereignty, a quiet but powerful assertion that their nations never disappeared. When we talk about crossing without borders, we're really talking about continuity. These rights aren't special exemptions, they're acknowledgments of history and of the people who have always lived there. Modern borders may define countries, but they cannot easily erase the nations that existed long before them. Every time an Indigenous person crosses that line by right, they reaffirm a truth older than any treaty, that the land remembers who it belongs to. The Jay Treaty and related laws still shape daily life for thousands of Indigenous people in both Canada and the United States. Understanding them isn't just about travel, it's about history, sovereignty, and respect. Borders may divide maps, but they cannot divide identity.